This is the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, two-thirds god and one-third mortal man. His was a legend spoken by storytellers around campfires thousands of years ago. And this is the tale that they told. In the days of old, when the gods walked among men, there lived a mighty king named Gilgamesh, ruler of the prosperous city of Uruk. Now Gilgamesh was a great warrior, valiant and strong, but also boastful and proud. He delighted in battle and subjugating his enemies, and he bragged about his exploits to anyone who would listen. But his people grew weary of their king's endless tales of war, for they had suffered much under his iron fist. Then one day, while Gilgamesh was boasting of his latest victory, a messenger arrived, bearing a royal summons from the neighboring kingdom. It was a challenge from their king to a wrestling match between the mightiest warriors of each realm. If Gilgamesh accepted, it would be an exhibition of strength between equals, but if he refused, he would be seen as a coward. And so, though he scoffed at the idea of a contest against any mere mortal, Gilgamesh accepted the challenge. When the time of the match arrived, Gilgamesh led a great procession to the edge of town, where he stood ready in the center of a crowd of spectators. Across from him stood his challenger, a giant of a man with muscles like loaves of bread on his arms. The two circled each other, sizing up their opponent, and then suddenly the giant lunged. He was fast, stronger than Gilgamesh had anticipated. With a Herculean effort, Gilgamesh managed to keep from being thrown off balance, and the match went on. Now Gilgamesh was used to quick victories, so he became frustrated at his inability to best his opponent, and in a moment of anger he lashed out and struck the giant across the face. In response, the crowd roared with anger, and the giant's coach began to protest, claiming that such actions were unbecoming of a champion. Then the referee stepped in and warned Gilgamesh that if he committed another foul, he would be disqualified. But Gilgamesh, blinded by rage, ignored these warnings and struck again. And so he was disqualified, and the giant was declared the winner. Gilgamesh, enraged by his defeat, wanted to continue fighting, but his advisors quickly led him away. They chastised him for bringing shame on the city and demanded that he find a way to redeem himself. As he walked alone through the streets, heads hung low, Gilgamesh considered his options, knowing that there was no way that he could beat his opponent fairly. Then he had an idea. He would seek the aid of Enkidu, the wisest man in the world, and together they would come up with a plan to reverse the outcome of the match. But when Gilgamesh approached Enkidu, he was met with an angry refusal. At first, Enkidu demanded to know why Gilgamesh had brought shame upon their city, to which Gilgamesh explained the situation. Then Enkidu asked, "Why do you come to me? You have done this all yourself." And Gilgamesh pleaded, "I'm ashamed, O wise one. Help me now and restore my honor." And Enkidu answered, "I will help you, but I cannot fight beside you." So he agreed to make Gilgamesh a magical belt that would give him superhuman strength. And so Gilgamesh set out once more, this time to confront the giant and demand a rematch. When the giant saw Gilgamesh approaching, he laughed and thought, "Here comes the silly king, surely to beg for mercy." But Gilgamesh stood firm and demanded a rematch, warning that this time the outcome would be different. Then the giant accepted, confident that he would win again. And as they prepared to begin, Enkidu handed Gilgamesh the magical belt and told him to put it on. But just as Gilgamesh reached for it, the giant cried out, "Wait, what is that?" And Gilgamesh said, "It is nothing." But the giant insisted that Gilgamesh remove the belt, claiming that he wouldn't fight unless both were unclothed. And though Gilgamesh didn't want to reveal his secret, he knew that he must win this match at all costs. So he took off the belt and tossed it aside. And then the two began to wrestle. The match was fierce. Back and forth they grappled until suddenly Gilgamesh felt a sharp pain in his side. He looked down to see a small thorn bush digging into his skin. The thorns tore at his flesh, making it impossible for him to move. And thinking quickly, Gilgamesh grabbed handfuls of dirt and shoved them into the wound. The giant, noticing the delay, took advantage and threw Gilgamesh to the ground. He leaned over the fallen king and said, "Give up, Gilgamesh, and I will end your suffering." But Gilgamesh refused. With the last of his strength, Gilgamesh reached for the discarded belt, pulled it tight around his waist, and the magical fabric healed his wounds in an instant. Then Gilgamesh sprung to his feet and attacked the giant with renewed vigor. The giant, unaware of the magic belt, fought bravely, but in the end, he was no match for Gilgamesh's newfound power. With a final, mighty heave, Gilgamesh lifted the giant off his feet and slammed him to the ground. The crowd roared with approval, and Gilgamesh had regained his honor. He returned home a hero, and that night he and Enkidu feasted in celebration. But as the night wore on, Gilgamesh grew melancholic and turned to his friend and asked, "Why did you betray me? You made me a magical belt, yet you never told me." And Enkidu answered, "Because you needed to learn that there are limits to strength. You boasted that no man could defeat you, yet here you were, losing to someone whose strength was equal to yours. I wanted to teach you humility, but also to show you that even the greatest among men must rely on something greater than themselves." Gilgamesh pondered these words and realized the wisdom in them. He understood that he had been arrogant and overconfident, and that without Enkidu's help, he might have been defeated and killed. He thanked his friend for his wisdom and for his sacrifice, and the two remained the best of friends until the end of their days. As the campfire crackled and popped, the storyteller paused for a moment, letting the silence stretch out before he continued. But some say that after defeating the giant, Gilgamesh became even more arrogant and boastful than before, and that Enkidu's belt was not magical at all, but simply a symbol of Gilgamesh's own inflated ego. They say that Gilgamesh couldn't accept that he might be defeated, even by someone whose strength matched his own, and that his so-called magical belt was nothing more than a figment of his imagination. Some say that Gilgamesh never learned the lesson that Enkidu tried to teach him, and that he continued to boast and brag for the rest of his life, never realizing that true strength comes not from physical power, but from humility, wisdom, and the courage to face one's own weaknesses. But that, my friends, is a story for another night. And so, the tale of Gilgamesh, the mighty king who learned a valuable lesson about the true meaning of strength, came to an end. The listeners sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the story they had just heard before breaking into lively discussion. As the fire danced and flickered, casting long shadows around the clearing, the friends talked excitedly about the lessons and morals of the story, debating the characters' decisions and the possible outcomes of different choices. One listener, a young boy, spoke up with wide-eyed wonder. "But the belt, was it real or not?" he asked, and the storyteller smiled, his eyes twinkling in the firelight. "That, my young friend, is for you to decide," he replied cryptically. And with that, the group continued to share stories and laughter around the campfire, each person taking something different from the tale of Gilgamesh and the magical belt.